So, how did the fantasy streaming war play out, and what does it tell us about adapting material? House of the Dragon and The Rings of Power are two recent fantasy television shows that were released around September of this year. They're based on Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin and the appendices of the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. So, let's examine who won and why. First, we need to look at the context of where each show came from and its source material. House of the Dragon appears out of the wreckage of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was a massively popular television series on HBO, with its first season premiering in 2011. It became the most popular television series of all time, running for 8 seasons. However, the last 2 seasons especially were met with much disdain for its rushed narrative, sloppy writing, and the poor execution of concepts. Game of Thrones was based off the critically acclaimed fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. The Rings of Power, on the other hand, come from the entirely well-received and insanely successful Lord of the Rings trilogy. These 3 movies were adapted from the well-loved trilogy of the same name by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, before we get into the battle on the screen between House of the Dragon and The Rings of Power, it's important to look at their actual source material. These 2 fantasy worlds are often compared, though they couldn't be further apart, which heavily factors into how these 2 streaming giants performed. George R. R. Martin, affectionately known as GERM, describes the best fantasy as being written in the language of dreams, reflecting back our own world, saying that, when he dies, I'd sooner go to Middle-earth than heaven. His world, the world of Ice and Fire, is gritty, violent, and unforgiving, exploring themes such as war, sexism, and feminism, and power. It's an extremist reflection of our own world. House of the Dragon is adapted from the book Fire and Blood, which is an in-world history book written from the perspective of a historian. The book chronicles the first half of the reign of the Targaryen dragon-riding family over the continent of Westeros. While not very well received due to its somewhat poor writing, many found the ambiguous nature of events that were laid out very interesting because it left a lot of room for speculation. Tolkien, however, treats fantasy as a grand escape, away from our world, describing it as our duty to escape into these worlds and take as many people with us as we can. Middle-earth may be violent, sure, but it is defined by its wonder and its mysticism. Rings of Power is based on the appendices of the Silmarillion, a more concise telling of the history of the 3 ages, which cover the first 55,000 years of Tolkien's world. Amazon, the producer of the Rings of Power, were limited by what source material they could use, as they couldn't use most of the actual content in the Silmarillion. And now we come to the premiere of both shows. House of the Dragon premiered just a week before The Rings of Power did, opening to high critical praise and some of the highest concurrent viewers of an HBO show since the last season of Game of Thrones, hitting a 9.3 million viewers throughout its run. House of the Dragon, also called Hot D, was very closely adapted by co-showrunner Ryan Condal, who emphasized his commitment to stick as close to the source material as possible. In the end, the general consensus is that the show overall was good, an improvement to the story told by Fire and Blood, along with fantastically choreographed action, political turmoil, incredible shots, and excellent writing and dialogue. However, the show's not without its faults. Far from it. The major problems are the time jumps and the poorly written shock moments. The time jumps, the biggest being 10 years between episodes 5 and 6, led to inconsistent characters from episode to episode. While it's not unrealistic for these characters to change significantly in 10 years, it goes against one of the core rules of writing: show, don't tell. The shock moments also just stand out like a sore thumb. They're usually unnecessarily displays of violence that contradict characters' previous words and actions, and they overall just feel very out of place. The most egregious example being Kingsguard Criston Cole beating the king consort's paramour to death and facing little to no repercussions. Despite these flaws, the show was overall met with a very positive reaction, being renewed for a second season just after the series premiere. Rings of Power, on the other hand, premiered with the first 2 episodes right off the bat. The actual number of viewers hasn't been released, but The Rings of Power raked in over 1 billion minutes of watch time, which did greatly beat out Hot D's 700 million. However, the reaction to Rings of Power was considerably more negative. Amazon sunk in over $1 billion in its shows. It's absolutely beautiful, but that won't save a show from poor dialogue, messy storytelling, and conflicting choices, which don't at all align with the source material. Take this line from Prince Durin: Give me the meat and give it to me raw. I mean, that's a ridiculous line. The key to understanding why Hot D is overall won in the end is seen in Rings of Power's story structure and how un-Tolkien-like it is. The Rings of Power is built on a mystery box structure, J.J. Abrams' favorite story technique, which relies on layers of mystery building to one big reveal, information being slowly revealed as the story progresses. Tolkien usually does almost the exact opposite. He typically establishes his story by setting out with clear, defined goals, purposes, and letting the story play out. This isn't to say that mystery boxes don't work. They do, very well in fact. Take the movie Knives Out, which did very well both critically and financially. However, this doesn't suit Tolkien's writing style. In combination with the limited source material Rings of Power could adapt, it led to the story essentially being a billion-dollar fanfiction project. The limited source material also meant that the writers had constraints on what names and events they could use, changing what characters do, or entire events. This fundamentally changed the entire narrative, making the entire project all right, but overall very confusing and disjointed. Take the entire character of Halbrand, whose twist character was revealed to be the big bad of the Tolkien universe, Sauron. His character, again, was just okay, but it conflicts with where Sauron was supposed to be at this point in the lore. Sauron's plan this time revolved around slowly gaining the trust of the elves, getting them to build the Rings of Power, which sort of happens by the end of the season, but the Rings of Power compresses a lot of the time between events, and it really ends up just not being the same story. This happens in both Hot D and the Rings of Power, but it works much better for Hot D. So, why is this? It all boils down to subtlety and the changes that are made. The difficulty of making the Rings of Power was the material that the showrunners could draw from, being only the appendices. This greatly limited what events the showrunners could portray. For example, again, Halbrand. At this time in the books, Sauron was masquerading as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, befriending the elven smith Celebrimbor and tricking him into making the Rings of Power, but after hundreds of years, instead of just a short time as shown in the show. Galadriel and Gil-galad, main elf characters, didn't quite see through Sauron, at this time Annatar, in the Silmarillion, but they got a weird vibe from him, kicking him out and sending him to Celebrimbor, Lord of Eregion. However, in Rings of Power, Halbrand tricked all the elves, befriending Galadriel until the very end. He had her convinced to basically make him king over the Southlands of Middle-earth, the place which eventually becomes Mordor. House of the Dragon also significantly changes source material. However, it mostly consists of small changes which build up to changing the original narrative quite a bit. Small changes, like characterizing Lionel Strong differently, or large changes, like making Viserys this deeply sympathetic character, or reducing Daemon Targaryen to this one-dimensional character. It all mostly adds to the story. There are plenty of poorly written changes, mainly centering around Daemon Targaryen and Criston Cole. Take Criston, for example. His main role in the book, Fire and Blood, is to be Kingmaker, crowning King Aegon II, but the role is given to a nameless Septon as he just stands by. Alicent Hightower becomes a much more sympathetic character as well, her age being a seemingly small change which led to transforming almost the entire narrative of the story. In Fire and Blood, the feud between Alicent and the Princess Rhaenyra is between a 9-year-old and an 18-year-old, whereas in House of the Dragon, their closeness in age and their friendship drive the entirety of the story. House of the Dragon isn't a perfect TV show. The Rings of Power isn't the worst TV show. But the point is how you change the source material that matters. Subtlety is the key. Both shows had big challenges to overcome. House of the Dragon had to succeed in the face of the collapse of Game of Thrones, while the Rings of Power was hugely limited by the source material. The differences between why Hot D has beat Rings of Power to a pulp comes down all to the little details. Both take missteps, but the effect of twisting Tolkien's story so much puts the audience out of the show. Combined with poor dialogue and sometimes puzzling story decisions, Rings of Power is, again, just okay. The shock moments and time skips for House of the Dragon don't do it any favors, but the care put into the writing, the direction of the story, and the well-thought-out characters make the viewer entrenched in the world. The Rings of Power has big characters with little relatability. In the current world narrative of deep, real, gritty stories, The Rings of Power stays on the road of Tolkien high fantasy, but is also marred by generally poor writing. Plus, it helps that HBO had full access to all of George R. R. Martin's works. And with that, thanks for watching.